Et maintenant, Charleston, présenté également par le groupe chorégraphique du Moulin Rouge.
Saigon, 1965. Fun capital of a country at war. It is a bizarre contrast to the gunfire just moments away. In Saigon nightclubs, everything's coming up roses. As American aid pours in, a luxurious lifestyle develops within earshot of the war. At base camp, the Americans fight the day's battles each night over a 15-cent beer. The Officers' Club of the Helicopter Support Company. Outside, the temperature is 95. Inside, it is air-conditioned. The music is always stateside.
Well, sir, it's quite an operation we had today, wasn't it?
After the nightly movie, the talk usually centers on the war, on the action hours earlier.
Good job. I saw you splatter one right in the back with a rocket.
Roger got lucky again. That was a lucky shot, no, Bert, really.
Blew the other one about 10 feet. I got the other two with the machine guns.
Yeah.
It's very satisfying to know that sometimes you do kill people with these things.
In 1965, there is confidence that the war can be won. The first U.S. combat troops are pouring in. The soldiers bring a superpowered technology and an overwhelming culture. Infantry go into battle backed by massive firepower. Field commanders can rely on unprecedented air power to minimize and evacuate casualties. The troops can rely on unprecedented comforts. And politically, the U.S. now feels it has a reliable ally. A military council takes power in mid-65. There's a new prime minister, Air Marshal Uneasy. Primeir Ky is a tough, flamboyant figure. He heads the 10th government in 20 months. The U.S. military commander, General Westmoreland.
Ky had a lot of charisma. He had a flair, and he was well liked by the troops, and very well liked by the Vietnamese. He was a man of action. He was swashbuckle, but at the same time, he was highly intelligent.
Primeir Ky fully supports the increasing U.S. combat commitment in South Vietnam.
I think it's normal that when Vietnam, as a part of free world country, was attacked by communists, with the Chinese at that time and Russian behind them. So I think it's a duty of America to come for rescue.
In February 1966, Ky is invited to meet President Johnson. After the constant change of leadership, Ky and his wife, Mai, provide an image of stability. As Ky leaves Saigon, his priority is to get more economic aid. President Johnson enthusiastically agrees. He wants victory in what he calls the other war. In Hawaii, Johnson tells Ky, "We are here to talk peace. We are determined to win not only military victory, but victory over hunger, disease, and despair." Ky gets dramatic evidence of American support. He asks for a television network to promote social reforms. Within a month, TV has come to Vietnam. To fight the economic war, the U.S. in 1966 commits $750 million in road-building materials and equipment, in iron and steel products, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and vehicles of every kind. He and his wife provide the military regime with a populist image. He demonstrates style and conscience. He even warns his fellow generals against corruption in their own families. America is pleased, but according to Ky, the American aid is also a corruptive influence.
Vietnam was poor. Vietnamese people are poor. So, of course, when 500,000 American soldiers were present in the soil of Vietnam, they brought with us a living condition that, compared to the Vietnamese living conditions, is so high, so comfortable, that in many ways it corrupted.
Items go directly from the base to the streets. Cognac, wine, scotch, and always beer and cigarettes. The black market employs thousands of street vendors. American affluence creates resentment among Vietnamese troops and officials. South Vietnam's chief of pacification, Colonel Nguyen Bay.
A colonel like myself get only $70 a month. So at the meantime, an interpreter or a girl who are working for the Americans get at least $200 to $300 a month. And to compare the salary of the president or a minister in the civilian side, get at least only $100 or $150 a month.
Corruption spreads on a huge scale. Often there is little check on government imports. Primeir Ky investigates. He finds enough cement on order to turn the whole of Vietnam into a concrete platform. When Saigon imports 40 garbage trucks, many are stolen. Vehicle thefts become an industry. Even tanks and helicopters are being sold to the communists. There are brothels outside all large American bases. The girls are usually war refugees. Tens of thousands become prostitutes. In 1966, the U.S. Army reports that 1 in every 4 GIs has venereal disease. For 2.5 million young American men, Vietnam is a part of growing up.
I think the women are too fast for us boys here.
Too fast.
Fast. I don't have any opinion. I'm married. I love them myself.
The military bases are like little America.
When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown. When you've got worries, all the noise and the hurry seem to help, I know. Just listen to the music of the traffic in the city.
Hey, you're a Saigon cowboy. In Saigon, BC?
For the GIs, the shoeshine boys are an institution. For the street kids, the Americans are a national resource.
How much change you got?
Parting the GIs from their money is a widespread game. The objective is to shine their shoes if necessary and get the shirts off their backs if possible.
How much you give it? 40p. Shit. I gave it you at tomorrow, you know.
Americans are aware of their cultural impact. An officer who did official studies, Brian Jenkins.
Where the American soldier goes, so goes American culture, but in perhaps never before to the degree that was the case in Vietnam. The wealth of our country, our technology permitted us to carry this to absurd lengths. And the absurdities are numerous. The Armed Forces television station in Vietnam, broadcasting daily the weather reports of the United States.
ARVN presents Bobby and the Weather. Now with reports on weather conditions stateside, Vietnam and R&R, here's that bubbling bundle of barometric brilliance, Bobby.
Now, first in Big D, you long, tall Texans out there had a cool, fair day of 68. Moving down through the Swanee River to the Miami Beach area was a cool, fair day of 77. That's the way the weather has been in our part of the world this evening. This is Bobby saying good night from American Forces Vietnam Network. And this evening, I'd like to send a special salute to the fellas out there of the 92nd Assault Helicopter Company. And thank you, fellas, for watching. Until Monday, have a pleasant evening, weather-wise, and y'all know, of course, otherwise.
Weather. A look at tomorrow's conditions today with Channel 11's weather girl, Bobby.
Miss America goes to Vietnam. All over Vietnam, entertainers follow the combat troops. For young Americans raised on the images of World War II, Vietnam seems unreal. Soldier Jim Webb.
One of the hardest things, for me to really adjust in my mind was to step off of an air-conditioned plane where I just watched a first-run movie, and have this German stewardess say, have a nice war.
In the field, an aerial delivery. Inside, a can of cool beer. The war is unpredictable in its terror and its comforts. Soldier Tim O'Brien.
We had our own personal mascots, for example, or valets. Little kids, 7 or 8, would hook up with a soldier and would wash his socks for him, clean his rifle for him, sometimes carry his rifle for him if we were exceptionally tired that day, dig our foxholes for us at night. It was like a circus in some senses, going through town, going across this beach where the soldiers would be lined up, and then behind us, like a tail on a kite, would be 100, 150 Vietnamese kind of coming along for the ride. I had my assignee, my fellow, I called him Champion was his name, as I recall, a nice kid who would give me a back rub after a hard day on the march, who would clean my rifle for me. This little kid, 7 years old, knew how to take an M16 apart. I didn't.
Friendly relations in one region can change into nightmarish incidents in another. Civilians and guerrillas cannot be told apart.
With the civilians, in many areas of the Anwar Basin, they actively operated against us. And the worst incident that my platoon went through began when an approximately 7-year-old girl lured one of my teams into an ambush, in a North Vietnamese ambush. So we had that level. We had continually to deal with civilians who were either hostile or numb.
In 1966, serious anti-American demonstrations break out in the port city of Da Nang. Primeir Ky sends in troops to suppress the Buddhist-led protest. Similar demonstrations had led to the overthrow and assassination of President Diem 3 years earlier. Ky's forces managed to put down the rebellion. The military command applauds Ky for what it calls a solid political victory. But among Americans in Vietnam, there's a growing uneasiness, a feeling they alone are doing the real fighting. By now, 350,000 American troops are in action, mostly along the coastal lowlands and in the foothills north of Saigon. In 1966, 5,000 Americans die in battle. To sustain the war, North Vietnam is getting massive communist aid. War material from China and the Soviet Union is trucked several hundred miles along border infiltration routes to the fighting zones. During the height of the war, 1966-68, Soviet and Chinese aid is estimated at more than $2 billion, including sophisticated weapons for defense of the North. A senior Hanoi diplomat, Ha Van Lao.
The socialist countries, the National Liberation Movement, and the forces of peace and justice in the world, including the American people, and above all, the socialist countries aided us materially from a military point of view in order to help us in the resistance against American aggression. We considered this a very important factor in our victory, a factor that can't be overlooked.
The aid funneled south is stockpiled in hundreds of underground shelters. It enables the communists to sustain their hard-hitting mobile tactics. With Russian aid increasing, and with every sign of a long war, Primeir Ky wants to invade the North. He doubts America's staying power.
American, when you look at their past, they are impatient people. And that I told Mr. Johnson, I told Mr. Nixon many times. If you decide to go to the war, go it fast and quick and win it over. For a frustrated and long-sustained war, 15 years, 10 years, 20 years, you cannot, because you are very impatient people.
Americans in turn express impatience with the South Vietnamese army, calling its operations search and avoid. U.S. advisors privately describe the South Vietnamese military as 80% ineffective. Americans increasingly believe that South Vietnam is doing little to defend itself. Hundreds of thousands of young South Vietnamese are dodging the draft.
I remember one time going into Da Nang to watch a Bob Hope show. And we were going in on a convoy, all these guys on 6xs and all that, and getting into the heart of Da Nang and watching all these kids on Honda motorcycles that were Vietnamese kids, 18 or 19s, and me seeing the day before my buddies getting blown away of saying, hey, what the hell is happening here? These guys invited me, this country invited me over here to fight for their democracy, and yet these guys are running around in Honda motorcycles? What the hell's happening over here?
But Americans continue to support Prime Minister Ky. At heart, Ky remains a military man. He is flamboyant, blunt, and undiplomatic. He is close to the U.S. commander, Westmoreland, but Ky is considered a poor politician. After 2 years in power, he is moved aside by his fellow generals. Ky contends that the South Vietnamese forces were undercut by the Americans.
Most of the time during the war, they were trying to do things by themselves. You know, it's very funny and also very tragic that it happened. The Vietnamese communists and the communist world always treat us as a puppet of America. But then American people themselves also consider us as a puppet of America, not a true leaders of the Vietnamese people.
There was a paradox here in which, on the one hand, the leadership of South Vietnam was perceived as the puppets of the Americans by almost everyone except the Americans themselves, who then got none of the benefits of, if they indeed had been puppets, then we could have indeed manipulated them. It was the worst of both worlds, in a sense that they were perceived as puppets and yet could not be manipulated.
The U.S. military wants as many officers as possible to get combat experience. By late 1967, when Primeir Ky leaves office, 1 million troops have rotated through Vietnam.
A tour for American general or American officers was only 1 year or 2 year maximum. How you can expect them for a short period of just 1 year, 2 years, that they could arrive to understand fully the Vietnamese, not mental, but even they were not able to speak a few words of Vietnamese word. So I can say that the mutual understanding was none, zero.
Vietnam is the shortest tour ever for American combatants. In 1967, a U.S. general says, Americans haven't been in Vietnam 10 years. They've been here 1 year, 10 times. The South Vietnamese army, called ARVN, remains the hope and despair of the United States. Saigon's army grows to 1 million men, but continually fails in combat. Many South Vietnamese leaders blame this failure on U.S. military policy in the mid-60s. Former ambassador to Washington, Bui Diem.
The Americans should try to help the South Vietnamese, but they should encourage the South Vietnamese to do the job themselves, instead of trying to take over the job. I think that the Vietnamese people is a responsible people. A lot of things have been said about the corrupted regime of South Vietnam. Yes, there is from time to time corruptions, and there are bad people like everywhere else. But mainly, I think that there are millions of South Vietnamese who were willing to bear their own responsibilities in waging the war. And if they had been asked, and if one can explain to them what they have to do, I would say that they would do the job willingly.
The South Vietnamese soldier is often personally courageous. 250,000 die in the war. But each year, ARVN combat units lose more than 1/4 of their strength through desertion. For many years, the fighting equipment provided to the ARVN is inferior to the U.S. and to communist weapons. And the ARVN is poorly led. Officers are frequently picked for political loyalty rather than military ability. When the final battles come, first officers, then the men, break and run.